Hello, and welcome to a book or two to review 17. Goodness gracious me, 17 already. And today's book is Naval Aviation in the First World War by R.D. Layman. And it's an older book. It is that, indeed. Printed in 2002, so originally, though, copyrighted and first published in 1996. So it's not an ancient book. It's not like some of my older books, but it is definitely an older book by today's standards. And by what I've been reviewing recently standards. And it's a good one. It's Naval Aviation and its impact and influence in the First World War. And I would consider it a bit of a foundational text in some regards. I have to say there are some very interesting bookmarks in here. But there's also some very interesting and cool pictures, including my favourite, the Sopwith cuckoo laying an egg, or first torpedo bomber dropping a torpedo. It's one of those little books which really does contain a lot of content. And my favourite chapter is chapter 10, which I'm going to read to you as an example. And then I'm going to discuss it. While the submarine was coming to dominate naval warfare during 1914-18, an anti ship was evolving that in a few decades would equally revolutionise conflict at sea. The flight deck aircraft carrier. From the moment heavier-than-air flight became feasible, the type had been predicted. It was obvious that if an airplane was to take off from and alight on top on a ship, the vessel would require a long, unobstructed flat surface atop its hull. Forecasts of what remained the basic principles of flight deck carrier were made well before the Great War by, among others, the French aviation pioneer Clement Ader, American aero historian Victor Lofred, and British Rear Admiral Mark Kerr. Simple as the idea seemed, translating into reality was quite another matter. One is reminded, although it's not exactly apros, of Clausewitz's dictum that everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. The design of the carrier confronted naval architect with a myriad of problems. Some were obvious. For instance, if the flight deck was to be unobstructed, the aircraft would have to be housed below it, requiring large, open, interior spaces that could threaten hull strength. Other problems were unforeseen. Of these, the greatest was how dangerous to an alighting aircraft would be the buffeting air turbulence created by the torrent of engine room gases streaming from a funnel. Even a normal centerline superstructure created potentially perilous air currents. But how could a vessel lacking such a structure be conned and navigated? Also unforeseen was the need for some kind of an apparatus to slow an alighting aircraft to a stop on deck. Development of such arresting gear constitutes in itself a complex chapter in the aircraft carrier story. How unrecognised some obstacles were is shown in the first proposal for a British Naval Aviation vessel, designed submitted to the Admiralty in 1912 by the shipbuilding firm of William Beardmore and Company. It featured a clear fore and aft flight deck, but this was flanked on both sides by parallel structures complete with funnels and masts, and connected by an overhead gallery. The concept was not merely unrealistic, but positively deadly, yet it was to recur for several years in proposed carrier designs. Fortunately for any aviators who might have been called upon to risk landing on such a ship, the Beardmore proposal was rejected, the Admiralty deciding to withhold judgment on what an aviation vessel should be until experience had been gained with the operation of seaplanes by the cruiser Hermes during the 1913 manoeuvres. The aviation ship authorised in 1914 as a result of this experience, the Ark Royal, to be described fully later, differed completely from the Beardmore design. If by 1914 the aircraft carrier was an idea whom time had come, there were those who questioned the need or practicality of such a vessel. Instead of putting all one's aerial eggs in one floating basket, they argued, aircraft should be dispersed on individual conventional ships. Such was the view of the US Navy's Captain Chambers. If you consider what we do currently these days, we have helicopters on pretty much every escort, and we have an aircraft carrier which has the fixed-wing aviation assets. And we, especially as you get into the drones, you're going to have drones aboard all sorts of ships as well. So it might well be a continuation that you have both a dispersed and centralized. So for fixed-wing aviation, maybe for fixed-wing larger drones and fixed-wing aviation, you're probably still going to continue with an aircraft carrier. But for rotary and drone aircraft and drones and things which are capable of vertical takeoff and economical vertical takeoff, you might well have them starting to operate from the rest of the escorts as a distributed manner, because for security. The goal of adopting conventional vessels to operate aircraft generated many wild and weird schemes. In the long run, both approaches were taken, and virtually every major conventional warship of the 1930s and early 1940s was equipped with aircraft. Controversy did not really end, however, until the later years of the Second World War saw the demise of the shipborne seaplane, and eventually the implementation of the helicopter, although that was already available far earlier than is often presumed. In the interim between the two world wars, a third approach was advocated: creation of a ship that would combine the functions of gunnery vessel and carrier in one hull, the progenitor of which was the British Vindictive of 1918. This chimera was pursued for decades, but Chimera was pursued for decades, but only a handful of so-called hybrids were built, and all were unsuccessful. Returning to 1914, by the start of the Great War, the conventional wisdom was, as described earlier, that the seaplane, for obvious reasons, constituted the ideal shipboard aircraft. This turned out to be not so simple a proposition. It's found that the seaplane placed many demands on a warship, some of which were detrimental to its employment as a fighting vessel. A seaplane required stowage space, which on a cramped vessel was often difficult to find. It needed some form of shelter to protect it from the ravages of wind and wave, as well as from salt air corrosion of its engine and other metallic parts. Storage room had to be found for its fuel, lubricants, and items essential to its maintenance. Launching structures such as ramps or platforms tended to hinder normal shipboard activity and restricted training arcs of guns. The major handicap of the seaplane, it must be repeated, was the unreliability inherent in its total dependence on the whims of the water from which it had to ascend until development of the shipboard catapult and alight. It could never be counted on to function when and where it might be needed. As this problem became increasingly apparent, the case for a specialized vessel from which land planes could operate gained strength, reinforced by the growing superiority of the land plane's performance. There can be no doubt that the flight deck carrier could have come into existence and would have come into existence eventually. It was too logical a concept to have been ignored, but it was the exigencies of the Britain's Royal Navy during 1914-18 that caused it to appear when it did. It did not, of course, spring Aphrodite-like from the foam, but was the product of an evolutionary process. It was one of the oddities of history that the process was accelerated by two Germans, Ferdinand von Zeppelin and Alfred von Tirpitz. Zeppelin's rigid airstrip possessed qualities that made it eminently suitable as a naval scout. It was far superior to the aeroplane in range and endurance, had an equally wide field of oceanic vision, could achieve higher altitudes, could more easily lift the heavy and space-consuming wireless apparatus of the period, possessed high speed relative to surface vessels, and enjoyed an early virtual immunity to attack in the air. The German Navy, however, belaying British fears, was ill-equipped with airships when the war began. Tirpitz had resisted introduction of the type. For one thing, he doubted its reliability. As a naval officer who had got to know the force of the wind and the malice of squalls of sailing ships, he was to write later, "I never promised myself much from the airships." He also resented diversion of funds for construction of battleships and torpedo boats that were fundamentals of his naval strategy. Yeah, Tirpitz's naval strategy. As recounted in Chapter 4, Tirpitz was finally pressured into accepting airships, and an ambitious program of construction of them and bases for them was undertaken. Bases were equally as important as the ships themselves, for these giant craft, longer than most battleships and ocean liners afloat, required equally huge structures to shelter from the elements. Tirpitz was correct in his belief that the airships was highly vulnerable to the malice of the wind. It was. The newly formed Naval Airship Division got off to a rocky start. Its first two ships were destroyed in mid-air accidents, killing most of the division's experienced cadre, and recovery from these disasters was barely underway when the war began. There was only one operational Zeppelin in August 1914, and only four by the end of the year, divided equally between the North Sea and the Baltic fleets. The Phoenix-like rise of the Naval Airship Division, resulting in Germany creating by 1918 the largest fleet of rigid airships in history, was a consequence of the interplay of German and British naval strategies. The Admiral Stab expected the Royal Navy to attempt a classic 19th century close blockade in the German coastal shallows, where British superiority in dreadnought could be nullified by mine and torpedo. It's always so annoying when the enemy doesn't do what you tell them to do. The High Seas Fleet, which, contrary to its name, had no plans for high seas operations, therefore initially adopted a posture that Ambushier described as awaiting the enemy's offensive. There was, however, no offensive to await, for the British Admiralty, having studied the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War, in which mines inflicted severe losses on the vessels investing Port Harbour, had decided on a policy of distant blockade, choking off entrances to the North Sea far from German shores. Amazingly, both sides studied the same war, drew the same conclusions, and the Germans didn't expect the British to go to the natural occurrence of those conclusions and therefore plan for a different kind of war. Baffled by the failure of the enemy to appear and constrained by the Kindness's order that losses to his beloved capital ships were to be avoided, what is it about German leaders and not wanting to lose their ships? No one wants to lose their ships, but if you don't actually operate them, there's no value in them. The German fleet turned to what Scheer frankly termed a guerrilla policy. Attempts to whittle down the ground fleet by traps and ambushes, overwhelming isolated segments of it until numerical equality or superiority in dreadnought strength was achieved. Then a fleet action can be fought on advantageous or at least equal terms. Such a policy demanded continual and efficient reconnaissance. The ambushes could not be laid without knowledge of the location activities of the British. But the High Seas Fleet was woefully deficient in scouting vessels as a result of a policy decision by Tirpitz when in 1897 he set about creating the modern German Navy. He depreciated the value of scout cruisers under his risk theory, or Risikogedanke, in which a strong battle fleet was to be considered in the North Sea as a potential threat to Britain. Because Britain, again, has a history of responding so well to being threatened. I mean, really, as a nation, we cower. Britain is known to be a nation which, when you threaten, they collapse. Admittedly, there is the whole history of Danegeld, which you can go to, but come on. It's like, when you're basing your entire strategy of we'll bomb them and they will surrender. It doesn't... The theory was that the ultimate strength of the German fleet would deter an eventual opponent, i.e. Britain, from risking an all-out naval encounter with Germany, because even if he emerged victorious from battle, such an enemy might then find himself at the mercy of a third strong naval power or even coalition. True, but what is the rule Britain has? To be as strong, a law, pretty much action, to a law to be as strong as the next two naval powers combined. And that means you have to inflict a lot of losses before there is another naval power who is strong enough to take them on. And if they outnumber you by that much, what is the chances you're going to inflict that level of losses? In an influential memorandum of June 1897, general considerations of the construction of our fleet according to shipcloth designs, Tirpitz declared, against England, indeed against any fleet penetrating our home waters, the value of scouting vessels is much reduced. Such vessels represent, in a sense, a reduction from the forces needed for the ultimate outcome. Tirpitz later had second thoughts and eventually proposed building a total of 40 light cruisers. But the damage would be done. Just as the High Seas Fleet was badly in need of scout cruisers, its table of organisation upon the outbreak of war listed only 6 of them. Fortuitously, the airship was there to compensate for the lack, not of course immediately, but a crash program of airship and airbase construction was quickly undertaken. An airship could be produced far more cheaply and quickly than a cruiser. Construction cost of 6 light cruisers built during 1909 to 1912 averaged £405,494 per vessel, while the cost of 8 airships constructed by the 20th of February 1915 averaged £50,875 apiece. Building time for the 6 cruisers ranged from 24 to 33 months. Some of the early airships were churned out in as little as 5 weeks, and only 6 or 7 months was required for construction of later, larger craft. As the airships began to become available in greater numbers, they not only provided the High Seas Fleet with the scouting craft it needed, but permitted the bombing campaign against Britain. But even earlier, they had stimulated the development of aviation vessels by the Royal Navy. It started on the eve of the Battle of the Marne, when Churchill agreed to the request by Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, that the RNAS assume responsibility for the aerial defence of Britain, freeing the RFC for field operations on the continent. Still under the belief, unjustified as it was in 1914, that the major aerial threat would come from airships, Churchill inaugurated an aggressive policy towards them. Realising that a proper build-up of defences in Britain itself would take considerable time, he concluded that it was no use sitting down and waiting for a year while these preparations were completed. Only offensive action could help us. I decided immediately to strike, by bombing from aeroplanes at the Zeppelin sheds, wherever these gigantic structures could be found in Germany. Consequently, attacks were made by land-based RNAS aircraft on German Army Zeppelin hangars at Köln and Düsseldorf, only one of which was successful, as well as the raid on Friedrichshafen, previously described. The German advance through Belgium and northern France, however, soon placed such targets beyond aerial range, which had been the case from the start of the German fleet's airship bases. If the latter were to be attacked, it could be accomplished only by aircraft taken by sea to within striking range. Let's see what's coming up here. The means for this were at hand in the form of 3 vessels taken over in August for use as seaplane carriers: the cross-channel passenger ships Engadine, Riviera, and Empress. They were selected because of their relatively high speeds, 18 to 21 knots, which permitted them to keep pace with battleships, although not with cruisers and destroyers. Crudely converted by addition of 4.5 canvas shelters and seaplane handling booms, they were originally to have gone to Jellicoe's battle fleet at Scapa Flow, but as a result of the Churchillian anti-airship offensive, were dispatched instead to Commodore Turret's Harwich Force. After several false starts, they mounted an attack on Christmas Day in 1914, and an airship base the British believed was at Cuxhaven on the German mainland, but which was actually some distance from the city. The attack was unsuccessful, but resulted in the first open-water naval battle in which aircraft were the sole striking weapons employed by both sides. Opposing surface warships failed to exchange a single shot, and although both British and German submarines were present, they proved ineffective. A secondary motive for the attack was the hope that the presence of a small surface squadron deep in German waters would lure elements of the High Seas Fleet out to a position where they could be engaged by the Grand Fleet, which sortied in distant support of the raising force, although too far distant to have intervened had turret ships been subject to surface action. The Germans, however, failed to raise to the bait, responding only with aircraft and U-boats. This so-called Cuxhaven raid set the tone and tactics of British carrier operations in the North Sea and adjacent waters for nearly the entire rest of the war. Attempts to attack land objectives, with airship bases ranking high on the target list, coupled with efforts to intercept the Zeppelins in the air. The winter of 1914-15 demonstrated that something more substantial than canvas was needed to protect the carrier's aircraft from elements. So in early 1915, all 3 were fitted with large aft hangars. The same treatment was given to the next converted vessel, the Isle of Man packet Ben My Cherie. These slab-sided structures made the vessel somewhat tricky to handle in strong winds, especially at slow speeds, but served their purpose admirably. This is a very good book, and it makes you start to think a lot about the history of what we've been told and the history we are traditionally taught. And when I say the history we're traditionally taught, etc., I mean the stuff that you probably hear parroted on the television and a lot often, which is usually, because it's simpler to point it out that way, that this appears in World War II or this appears dramatically then. A lot of the history begins in World War One. The British obsession with the fuel systems on their carriers and having the oil drain out the lines and having all the valves and having all the fire prevention measures comes from experience with Ben My Cherie and other seaplane carriers in World War One. When they find the fires going off them, it becomes an obsession. And this goes into World War Two, when you suddenly find the British ships, when they're hit, they're far less likely to have a massive fire because of their systems, their safety measures in place. A legacy of World War One. Now, I think the interesting thing to me, always with World War One and its legacy in naval aviation, is what happens immediately afterwards. Because I firmly believe that if the Admiralty had pressed, and if this is where I put the blame on PT, the Royal Navy could have maintained the section of Fleet Air Arm, the Royal Naval Air Service, which was to do with carrier operations. It was a very small part in the 18, and I think it would have made a very big difference to the Royal Navy going forward. I think if you're forming a Royal Air Force at that point, the number of squadrons the Royal Navy has, Royal Naval Air Service is providing assurance on the Western Front and around the world, the heavy bomber squadrons, all those sort of things, it's difficult to keep hold of. You can probably make a case for the Maritime Patrol for Coastal Command, or at least that being a shared service, which would have made sense. But you could have certainly made a case for, look, the seaplane carriers, it's just easier for command, control, and all the things of discipline aboard ships, etc., like Marines, if we keep them as part of the naval service. We'll share technical staffs, we'll have joint staffs and all those things, but we'll keep it as part of the naval service. All those things could have been put forward and would have probably been accepted. Because the people who wanted the Ares 1 Royal Air Force would have seen that as, if we don't accept this point, we're going to get the Navy absolutely campaigning against us, and we might end up losing the whole of the Royal Naval Air Service. Or we get the vast majority of it, and we just carriers, which they didn't think mattered that much at all. The other big thing, as I've mentioned before, would have been the conversion of the Admiral class battle cruisers to aircraft carriers, rather courageous, glorious, and furious. A, they were bigger, but B, they were less advanced along their construction. So instead of you having to deal with a lot of stuff which was already there, they were literally at almost the hull level in certain things are going in, and you could therefore modify those ships far more easily. There was a lot less there. You had essentially blank canvases. You had a hull, which was a fast, big hull anyway. Okay, not perhaps your perfect aircraft carrier hull, but a very simple, a very good one available. And you would have probably also seen with those ships, probably deck-edge lifts, because the British were looking at them and were thinking about them. And that would have then made an even bigger difference, because if you'd had deck-edge lift large carriers in the Royal Navy from the late 1920s onwards, the Royal Navy you get in terms of naval aviation, in terms of reputation for naval aviation, going into World War II, in terms of what happens in World War II, could be very different. And the naval aviation legacy we could have today could be very, very different. But it all comes down to the history, which starts off in the First World War, and it's worth reading. R.D. Layman. Good book. I hope you enjoyed, and as ever, thank you. There is a link down below, if it works, to Amazon, where you can buy the book, and if you do use that link, I get a few pennies. Thank you. If anyone wants to know, I have had Amazon links active now for months, and I have not in any single month reached the level at which they have to pay me out. So it's at some point, who knows, might get there. But more successfully on those people who want to support me are Patreon. Thank you very much to all the patrons. When this goes live, there should be a vote still going live. And again, I'll put a link down below for September's patron. Oh no, August's patron vote is live. Yes, August. And there is also, of course, joining the channel. And last I've checked, 5 more people join the channel. Not just subscribe, but join the channel. And I have to come up with another emoji. And this is something I'm finding incredibly interesting, because at the moment, I have 7 emojis, which are all custom made and only available on this channel. And another 5 people join, and I get 8. I get to make an 8th one. And it's skills. If you've heard episode 58 of Bilge Pumps, you'll have heard me and Drac and Jamie talking about the skills of you have to have running these channels. And I have to say, I've been quite pleased with the emoji creation skill I have now started to develop, because I'm starting to get some pretty cool, very, very customized emojis. And I'm not just talking about taking pictures and various things and adapting them, but actually, like the FSA one, which is for the recent one, firepower, speed, armor diagram. That one's entirely come up with by me. Entirely put together. And okay, yes, it's not exactly the greatest artwork in the world. I'm not going to claim that. But I'm quite proud of it. Anyway, that's enough rabbiting about me, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope you will enjoy the next one to come, which will be Royal Navy Battles and Honors of the Royal Navy by David A. Thomas. And I hope you're having a good time. Thank you for watching. Take care.